The Bill Simmons Podcast, presented by Chase. All right, Rob Mahoney is here. He writes for TheRinger.com. He has a piece about the Miami Heat that's up today. We're not talking about the Miami Heat. We're going to talk about first this year's WTF team, the New Orleans Pelicans. I don't know what to make of this team. You can catch them on any given night, and it's a completely different experience than the last night. I don't know if the players make sense together. Actually, I'm pretty sure they don't. I don't really know what the overall philosophy is. I don't know if they're trying to be a playoff team, if they're trying to be rebuilding. I'm just constantly confused. And there was some optimism because they won a couple games in a row, and people were like, here they go. Here's Zion. And then they got killed last night by the Bulls and have 100,000 breakdowns. And I guess my first question to you is, the Pelicans, what the fuck?
Yeah, how many exclamation points can we tack on to that WTF, do you think? But I was hoping you could answer this question because I think you're spot on in that it so much depends, your view of this team, on when you catch them. Even just like what stage in the season you caught them, because for a minute, it looked like they were going to live up to their personnel and be a tough-minded defensive team, scrounging out offensive rebounds to get points and just kind of struggling on that end because of their spacing issues. The script is completely flipped. And now this is all of a sudden a very competent offense. I think in part because they're really driven by Brandon Ingram and Zion Williamson. They're making that part of it work. But the defense, Jesus Christ. I mean, they're as inconsistent defensively as really any team out there.
Yeah, I would say other than Brooklyn, it's the team that's most likely to give up 140 on any given night to any team that knows what they're doing. So if you actually look at their stats and you haven't been watching that much, and you look at the stats and you look at Williamson and Ingram, and you go, all right, those guys are having good years, pretty efficient. And then you look at Lonzo and you look at Bledsoe. Lonzo's shooting 37% from three, Bledsoe's shooting 40%. So going into the season, you're like, well, their guards can't shoot. They're not going to be able to have enough space. Well, their guards are actually shooting okay. But then when I watch everybody together, they don't have a five-man lineup that I like. Like yesterday, they were playing Kyra Lewis with he got a little more run, and he's a really interesting rookie. He's really fast. He's a little De'Aaron Foxy, and gave them an energy that I was like, well, maybe I would like this version of the Pelicans more if fast, now unleash Zion a little bit, go up and down a little bit more. But I still don't know who the other two teammates would be with Kyra Lewis, Zion and Brandon Ingram. And I guess the fundamental question for me is, do Zion and Brandon Ingram make sense together on a team that's actually trying to win the title?
I think they make sense on offense. But the question, with Zion really broadly is, who are you going to put at the five that's going to make up for all he doesn't do defensively right now? And that's always been my issue with the idea of playing small and, putting him at the five. His rotations just aren't there. Really, the Pelicans as a team, if I were an opposing coach, I would say this is a team we can beat in rotation every time. They are a pass away from a defensive breakdown every time down the floor. And so if you keep moving the ball, you keep doing what you're supposed to do, they will mess up. And whether it's an undersized guy in the corner who doesn't quite rotate over all the way, a JJ Redick or a Josh Hart, they try hard, they do what they can, but they're not equipped to help rotation defenders if a guy like Zion isn't going to be one. So, I'm kind of bullish on the Ingram-Zion duo in general, but I'm really struggling to see how you put together those lineups. And I can see how they kind of got into this conundrum where they clearly wanted to have some veterans, or at least some veterans fell into their lap in terms of what was available and trying to get some picks and make their other moves. But long term, it's a weird team to build with. And then you get Lonzo into this conversation too, and what they want to do with him. It's kind of messy.
Yeah, so I look at it like how I look, like the Celtics, I think, are a good example of Jalen and Tatum. We're fine. I don't want to mess that up for the next 10 years. I feel like we can put pieces around those two guys and create whatever team we want with those two guys, and I'm happy because they complement each other perfectly. They're exactly the two types of guys you would want in the league and where it's going. And you can just fit in, like, if Kemba Walker can somehow play better, who knows if that'll happen. But the point guard who can create his own offense and do some pick and roll stuff, you get a rebounder, a couple shooters. I know what that team is.
Mm-hmm.
When I look at New Orleans and you think like, all right, Zion and Ingram 5 years from now, who do I want next to them? So it's like, let's start at the five.
Yeah.
Because it's clear that they don't want to play Zion at five, and I don't blame them. I think the the fantasy we had of this guy can be a Draymond Green type guy defensively, like that fantasy's gone. We've seen zero signs of that. It's like literally zero. So, all right, let's do a thought exercise with who's at the 5. Let's put them with Mitchell Robinson.
Okay.
Let's put a shooter who can defend in the 2 spot. Right? So somebody who can, like Lou Dort. We'll put Lou Dort there in the 2 spot.
Love it.
And then we'll put like an older point guard who knows what the fuck he's doing as the point. Like maybe like Mike Conley 4 years ago.
Yeah.
And that's our team. Is that team a title team? Because I feel like the answer is no. I still don't feel like you're going to be good enough defensively.
Yeah. I mean, that part's the struggle. And I wonder if Zion too, you mentioned, Lonzo and Bledsoe are shooting well this year, especially relative to what you would expect them to be. But defenses still guard them the same way. They still shrink down. They still want to put 5 bodies in between the rim and Zion if they can. What do you think that's going to mean for Zion's development? Because I could kind of see it both ways where on the one hand, you want him to get in space and have reps just making plays, reading defenses, figuring out what that looks like. On the other hand, getting by with minimal space is kind of what you have to do in the playoffs 90% of the time. So could this be, in its own perverse, twisted way, a good training scenario long-term for guys like Ingram and Zion to figure out just how hard it can be to create in difficult situations?
It seems like the book on Zion is if he gets the ball on certain points on the court, the teams panic and they just collapse on him. And I think one of the reasons, like you look at the Lonzo and the Bledsoe being 40% or close, every shot they take is completely wide open. So you almost have to factor that in. It's like, all right, they're 37% on wide open threes. What does that look like if they actually have to be defended? There was a play yesterday in the Bulls game, and I like listening to the New Orleans crew. The New Orleans guy, they interrupt each other. It's kind of like watching 2 uncles at a game. And they had one play where they had 3 guys on Zion, and the color guy was like, they triangle D'd him. Like he got excited about it. He had never seen like 3 guys collapse on different times, but it's like that's the book on how to defend Zion. And I want to get into Zion in a minute on how that goes. I think his year's going, but just the fact that he's being defended like that is probably a good sign for Zion, I would think.
I think so too. And I think Lonzo is figuring that out in a different way, in terms of his pick and roll with Zion is really starting to click now. And I think a lot of that came from figuring out he needed to get Zion the ball early. It's really fun to hold on to the ball and through alley-oops to Zion and watch him cram it through the rim. That's a good time for everybody. But it's probably more productive if you give it to this giant guy who's going to freak the defense out, even 15, 18 feet from the rim if he has any kind of momentum whatsoever. So I think that shift has been pretty important for their offense, just like getting Zion in more positions where he's going downhill against the defense, forcing them to make split-second instinctive decisions, and in some cases, business decisions. Do I want to put my body between this guy and the basket? It's not an easy one to make.
I'm going to say, I rarely do this where I go on the record. I'm going on the record with this.
Okay.
And I've done this a few times over the years, and I'm usually right. Long term, I don't think Ingram and Zion are together. I think at some point Ingram gets traded for a piece, and then there's a whole thing about we loved Ingram. It's just the fit of these 2 guys together. Yeah, offensively it can work, but does it make sense for it to work? Because to me, Ingram is like the perfect 4. Right? He's a stretch 4 who he's malleable. He can move around. Not really that good defensively, but at least he's got some length. And they'll flip him into somebody who is a more traditional Tatum Brown type of player, would be my guess. And I think that's how this plays out, because ultimately I don't see it. I think there's too many ways to get burned. You could put, again, Lou Dort, you could have an awesome 2-way point guard, and you could have a rim protector. And I still think, how are you stopping like somebody like, I don't know, Kawhi?
Yeah.
Who's guarding him if you have Zion and Brandon Ingram at the same time? Like, you're just always losing against Durant, against Tatum. You have to have a guy in your crunch time 5 who can guard those guys, and they're just never going to have that guy.
Well, and it's so weird to watch this group too, where, you would have thought a Stan Van Gundy team, if anything, they're going to be there with the second rotation, the third effort. Like, that's what his teams have done historically. It's just not there. And Ingram and Zion are the prime culprits of that, are guys who are just, parked on their guy in the corner. They're not going to budge to help anybody. This team right now for me, and I think the big red flag with them is they don't do any of that stuff that buys their teammates time on defense. The little bumps, the little holds, the little half rotations. It's all just kind of every man for himself a lot of times. And that involves, in some cases, Steven Adams running 25 feet from the rim to try to get back to his man. It doesn't work.
It's funny with Ingram. I was thinking this because they just signed a new extension, so they couldn't have traded him this year. The most logical trade was Ingram for Harden. And maybe they threw in a pick or two, but just like removing all the stuff about that they couldn't trade him, that it would have seemed abrupt, and whether Harden would have wanted to go to New Orleans, just as a pure basketball trade, just flipping those two dudes, letting Ingram have his own team in Houston, and then putting Harden with Zion and all of the stuff that could have come out of that. That was like the most fun basketball. Again, could not have happened because Ingram couldn't have been traded, but I just really like the idea of that. And it seems like ultimately, if you're going to unleash this, it's some sort of creator who's like a 6'4" to 6'6" type guy who can, not that Harden can play defense, but does that make sense, or am I overthinking it?
It does make sense, but it kind of makes me think Brandon Ingram is fated to be this guy who's constantly flipped to younger teams to be like their next star of the future, or the center of their team. And I mean, maybe that speaks to his fit and some of the complications that come with it if you're that kind of player.
Yeah, maybe that's who he is.
Yeah.
My fear with him is because I do think he cares about the right stuff. I thought Zach Lowe's piece was interesting about him, some of the quotes. And I do think he's gotten better. I think he gives a shit.
For sure.
But sometimes you could just be a good stats, bad team guy, right? A lot of the stats he put up last year ultimately didn't matter. The team sucked, and the fit with Zion, I guess, and it's time to talk Zion. The question for me, what's the ceiling compared to what I thought the ceiling was 2 years ago from what I'm watching? And I don't want to, I think he's had some really good moments. He's played less than 50 games total in his whole career. His numbers are pretty crazy for, he's basically 24-7 every game. He's almost shooting 60%. He's getting to the line 7.5 times a game. Eye test wise, there's a moment where if he's just has one person on his back, he could spin toward the paint. If he's on the left block, he can spin toward the paint, get whatever shot he wants. He can spin the other way and get that little lefty one-handed jump hook. He's pretty devastating in transition still.
Mm-hmm.
And yet, this is where I do the and yet. I felt like he was more explosive at Duke. He just was. He moved better. There's moments like dead ball moments. This is why I'm dying to see him in person, because I never want to overreact one way or another to stuff I see on TV. But there's stuff in person where it just seems like he's laboring, like he's got a limp, like he's carrying too much weight, like he's not happy. The guy at Duke played with so much joy. He was so competitive and so joyful. And that was like the thing that jumped at him more than anything. He just seemed like this guy that just loved basketball more than anything. And the guy I'm watching now seems like a guy who's on a professional basketball team, who's a little overweight, whose knee isn't 100%, maybe it's 95%, and doesn't seem to be playing with that same kind of joy that he had. What do you see?
I mean, I see the same difference in terms of just the pop of his athleticism. I think it's okay to say that. Players get very offended when you say, oh, you took a step back athletically, you're not moving the same way you used to. But realistically, look at this guy. He looks like a different player. The flow of his game is very different. And it was always going to be that to some extent. Moving against bigger, stronger NBA athletes, there were going to be some compensation, some trade-offs with that stuff. I think his game is changing. And it's okay, I think, if it's more of a below the rim bully ball type style. He's still very explosive horizontally. He can still go to the basket, he can still push people out of his way. It's just changing the scope of what that player looks like and figuring out how do we translate the way he does move well to trying to get him to be something on defense that he isn't yet. And so I don't know how we reconcile all those things, but there's no question that as a draft prospect and as an NBA player, those are two totally different guys to me. Now, the version we have now can still be a superstar. I think he's still well on his way to that. But the complexion of what his game looks like is different.
And to be fair, he's still a 101. I haven't seen anybody like him since Barkley a million years ago. he is still unstoppable in transition. If it's like a 2-on-1, 3-on-2, whatever, he can bulldoze his way to the basket as well as anybody in the league. He still seems like he's got a fast first step, where his quick twitch stuff is still good.
Yeah.
It's not like, but to me, it looks like he's carrying too much weight. And I'm obviously not the first one to say that, but he just looks 20 pounds too heavy to me. And you can really feel it in the air stuff. He jumped higher 2 years ago. Like, it's a fact.
Yep.
Go on YouTube, watch any Duke highlight thing. He just jumped higher. He was like Blake Griffin that first full Lob City Clipper season, where Blake Griffin was, flying over people. Zion's not flying over people. He's kind of going through people more. And I think that's been what's really surprised me, because he's only 20 years old. And that's what makes me wonder. I don't think he's like 80% healthy, but is it possible he's like 93% healthy, 95% healthy? What do you think, just from like a health standpoint? Where is he?
I mean, that could definitely be part of it. There's always, bumps and bruises we don't know about, little ailments we don't know about, nagging stuff we don't know about. I think that's part of it. I think with him, still in the bigger picture sense, you're looking at him as a guy who just breaks matchups regardless of that. Even if he is a little slower, even if this is kind of the speed he's going to operate at, if you're a team that has kind of a tweener stretch four type, how confident could you possibly be throwing that guy in front of Zion to compete with in transition, to get boxed out all the time? And that's kind of the long-term future of this play here, is all of the things we take for granted with modern basketball. Zion breaks that stuff. And so, whatever the best version of the Pelicans looks like, it's one that kind of works in contrast to the way the game is moving, that beats it. In the rock, paper, scissors of basketball, he can beat so much of this, the modern style.
There's 3.5 overpowering guys in the league right now: LeBron, Embiid, and Zion. And then
who's the half?
My half is Ben Simmons on the right night if the game is really up and down.
Oh, we got to get Giannis in there too.
Yeah, Giannis. I forgot about Giannis. I'm sorry, Giannis. Yeah, there's 4.5. No, I forgot about two-time MVP. There's 4.5. The Simmons thing, there's certain nights where it just looks like he looks like LeBron. Where he looks like young LeBron, where it's like, I'm getting the rim every time. And you're like, wow, why doesn't he do this all the time? And then the next night you watch him and he's 1 for 6.
Yeah.
So there's 4 guys and Zion's one of the 4. And he's doing that, I feel like, not at his athletic peak. But some of the stuff that he's doing is stuff I haven't seen on a basketball court in an NBA game. The back to the basket, there's been kind of a resurgence with back to the basket stuff this year, because we've kind of written it off, right? Like, the stuff Embiid is doing this year is late 80s Ewing-ish.
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, it helps when Embiid and Jokic both are just demolishing people on a nightly basis.
Jokic, I think that LeBron will have some moments on the low post that it's just kind of funny when we think 10 years ago how we were so upset that he didn't do that stuff.
Man.
And then the wild card to me is Giannis, who I just wonder every time he's on the low block or near the low block and gets the ball, the other team completely panics. And it would seem like maybe that's something you should do more often. You watch the end of the game yesterday, they're down 1. The play they run is to get Giannis this open 20-footer against the Suns, and he missed it. Did you think it was going in? I didn't think it was going in. He had 47 points. I still didn't think it was going in.
I mean, I thought Chris Middleton was looking real open in that right corner, unfortunately. So it was a tough outcome for them. But I mean, you have to like that Giannis wants to take that shot. He wants that to be a part of his game so badly, and they kind of need it, whether it's those face-up jumpers, long twos, whether it's the turnaround stuff in the post. They're going to need some of that eventually.
Quick Pelican stuff, just going back to them for a second. They're 11-13. They've lost to a lot of good teams. So if you're going to make the case, this might actually be a playoff team. They've lost to Utah twice, Phoenix, Lakers, Clippers, Miami, Indy, and OT. My questions to them, we talked about Zion and Ingram, whether it makes sense together. Second question, why did they trade Jrue Holiday again? What was the purpose of that?
I mean, especially given where they ended up, Holiday would have been a nice player to have around. I have to think some of it was in service of Holiday too, and trying to get him in a place where he could contend a little more easily.
Could they have not been close to contending with Zion and Ingram and Jrue Holiday?
Well, is Jrue Holiday, I mean, he's a better shooter than Eric Bledsoe. Is he changing the world of what they do if you swap those two guys out.
Do you like what they got back for them, knowing now that Giannis re-signed with the Bucks? Because you have to take this Eric Bledsoe contract that I don't think they could. He hasn't been a disaster, but I also think nobody's taking that contract at $19 million a year when he's a below average starting point guard. And then you get a bunch of picks that ultimately, like, who cares? Giannis is on the Bucks. Unless he gets abducted by a UFO, you're just getting a bunch of picks that are in the 20s. And I guess this goes back to what we talked about at the top. I don't understand the timetable with this team. What are they trying to do? Are they trying to just be frisky while also adding all these picks? Do they have a plan to compete? Like, how does the Steven Adams thing play in it? Why is he on this team? Why are they paying him $29 million a year and then an extension for $18 million after, when the price for centers like him is $6 to $9 million? And they gave up a pick.
He's definitely the confusing part of it. I think just in terms of that timeline that you're laying out. I get wanting to be competitive with Zion. I get wanting to put the right kinds of competitors around them. But what are those competitors doing right now? Because they strike me as a team that, for all, they have a lot of good veterans in this group, but they're missing kind of like the anchor players, like for their defense, for example. Like a culture setter, a guy who makes lineups make sense. And they just don't have those players. They have great individual talent. They can string together some really interesting stuff offensively. And frankly, they can be good for 2 or 3 quarters in a game. They just have one disastrous quarter in so many different games where they're giving up 40 points. You can't be doing that. You can't be digging yourself in that kind of hole.
They trade for Adams. I hated it immediately. And just my default was like, Adams, Zion, and Ingram playing together in the last 5 minutes of a game. I don't see it. I just don't see it. Yeah. And why do you want Adams in there clogging the paint for Zion? Don't I want spacers? Why do I want somebody who can't be 25 feet from the basket? I thought that was really weird. Here, people are like, well, they have so many picks. Have you actually gone through all the picks they have?
Let's do it.
I'm going to read them to you right now. They have their own pick in 2021. They have a second rounders from the Cavs and the Wizards, which are pretty good. Those are the only time I'm going to mention second rounders. 2022 Pelicans, they have their own pick. And they have the Lakers first round pick. Congrats. That's going to be the 28th pick. 2023, they can swap picks with the Lakers. And they have a lottery protected Nuggets first. Well, Davis just re-signed with the Lakers. LeBron looks like he's going to Tom Brady us and play till he's 45. I'm pretty sure I'm not excited about either of those picks. 2024, they can swap picks with the Bucks. Cool. I guarantee the Bucks have a better record than them. And the Lakers, they have their first round pick, which they can defer to 2025 if they want. So now they're playing the long game with that pick. So let's say they defer it. 2025, the Pelicans first, Bucks first, Lakers first. So out of those, I would say maybe you get lucky with the Lakers pick unless Giannis gets abducted by an alien. 2026, Bucks pick swap. Again, Giannis will be 32 at that point. Not sure that's going to matter. And then 27, Pels first, Bucks first. It's not exactly a motherlode.
No, I mean, there's no one pick you're waiting on. There's no like prime Timberwolves pick in this package that they've collected. I think they were in a tough spot with that in terms of the timing. And I think, especially coming off of the Bogdanovich debacle in Milwaukee, what like the state of play at that given time in that offseason, and like how much do we want to bet that Giannis is going to sign this extension or not? I think it was a reasonable thing to roll the dice on that. Especially when, there was definitely a market for Drew. He's a very attractive player. He can play with all kinds of backcourt partners. They could have driven things up and pushed that down the line if they wanted to. I just don't have a problem with taking that kind of risk at that time. A lot of the league was asking the same questions about Giannis, that they were coming to the same kind of shrugging conclusion about whether he was going to be a long-term piece in Milwaukee's future or not.
I thought it was a very good trade. I supported it. I signed off on it when they did it. But now you look at it, and it hasn't worked out, I don't think, the way maybe they were hoping it was going to work out.
Story of the Pelicans season in a lot of ways. Things not working out quite the way they wanted.
Well, I mean, I guess the difference between that pick and that trade and the Davis trade is in the Davis trade, they got Ingram.
Mm-hmm.
They got a real guy. in this trade with Milwaukee, they didn't really get anybody. You know, they got Eric Bledsoe and George Hill, who they then flipped for Adams and threw one of those picks in there, but they didn't really get like a staple. And I don't know if Michael Porter Jr. was available, and he certainly doesn't make sense to the team they have, but they didn't even get anybody like that. I was looking, we'll put a bow on the Pelicans here. So I'm looking at OKC. OKC's 10-14. They've just almost beat the Lakers twice. They're like super duper frisky. They're kind of in the mix to maybe make the play-in game, and you know, which I'm sure is Sam Presti's worst nightmare, right? He's probably looking at this going, the one thing I didn't want to do was be in the 7-10 range. I thought we were going to be terrible. I made all of these moves to try to be terrible, and we're not. If you're him, do you have to think about trading SGA and Dort? SGA, they're going to have to pay in a couple years. SGA single-handedly won them 5 games. Dort is somebody that I think would have real value on the market if they wanted to spin him, because he's on a cheap contract. He's the exact 3-and-D guy any team wants. Is there a match with the Pelicans? I'm making this up. I have no inside info. Pelicans have all these picks. Could they just motherload, make the huge offer for SGA and Dort and just try to make that their team? SGA, Dort, Ingram, Zion, and actually like try to be good right away.
But if you're the Thunder and your house is made of draft picks, are you really going to the store to buy more draft picks at that point?
I would argue the other way. Why not just keep going? Like you're basically taking more chances at the roulette wheel, right?
Yeah, but with picks that we just laid out aren't optimal. You know, if I'm the Thunder, I'm very comfortable with where we are. I think they're one of those teams that's in a place where it seems like almost no matter what kind of roster they put together, it turns out competent. It turns out to have a nice mix of players and talent. And they still have some moves down the line. You know, when George Hill gets healthy and they can move him on potentially, or Al Horford down the line, maybe there's some interest in him. I'm pretty if I'm the Thunder, I'm feeling pretty good about where we are.
So you don't think the Celtics can get SGA for Romeo Langford and a couple pick swaps?
Now we're getting into the long game here.
OKC's draft pick barrage is so much more impressive.
Oh, sure.
Just this year, Houston swap, top 4 protected. Miami first, Denver first, Golden State top 20 protected. 2022, OKC first. They get to keep it if it's top 15. Clippers first. And then they have this Suns pick that's protected. It gets later, and then it's finally unprotected in 25. 2023, they can swap with the Clips. Miami first, which is lottery protected 3 years, unprotected in 26. Nuggets first, lottery protected for 3 years. Next year, OKC first, Clips first. Then there's a Houston possibility, top 4 protected. And then those Suns Miami picks might trickle down and be there. 2025, they get the best of OKC, Clips, and Houston. They get the best of those 3. There's a possible Philly top 6 protected that year, 1 through 4 and 26, 1 through 4 and 27. And then all those other ones I mentioned. 26, they have OKC first, Clips first. That is like 10. If I'm Presti, I'm insulted when they're comparing New Orleans and Griffin's pick load to my pick load. I'm like, get the fuck out of here. I have like a Ferrari. They have, a Prius.
Well, I mean, this is only just like a gem in what is now a pile of gem draft picks. But the picks that got attached to the Westbrook Chris Paul trade going from Houston to Oklahoma City.
Unbelievable.
I have a feeling we're going to be talking about those for a long time.
I actually think that Westbrook trade now looks worse than the KG Pierce trade. Because when Brooklyn made that trade, and the piece everybody is missing is Brooklyn every year was going to spend the most money in the league. It was inconceivable that they were ever going to be bad. Within a year, Prokhorov's like, we're not going to spend money anymore, cut costs. And the Celtics stumble into this unbelievable draft pick barrage that, if Prokhorov was just spending $180 million a year in his roster, there's no way any of those picks are in the lottery. And we're remembering that completely differently. The Westbrook thing, Presti had to know from a physical kind of where Westbrook's body was potentially 2-3 years down the line. He had to have been so delighted that he got all that stuff for him.
Well, do you feel like that trade was about Westbrook, or was it about keeping Harden happy for Houston and potentially, if you're the Rockets and you're sensing things are at a certain precipice, are you making that trade basically just to try to take your last gasp at keeping your franchise guy?
I think that was the Fertitta and his son saying we've got to keep James happy. I've known Daryl a long time. We've never talked about that Westbrook trade, so I just want to say that. We've never had like a real talk since he left about, hey, what the fuck happened with that Westbrook trade? That trade goes against every conversation I've ever had with him about basketball. He never wanted to trade future picks like that. And just that Westbrook's game was just not a game that he would have been enchanted with in any other conversation I ever had. So yeah, you're right. OKC was in the right place, right time twice. You have this crazy Houston thing. And then you have this Paul George situation that had like a 12-hour window, right?
Yep.
Where either move it or not. So you think they keep everybody and they don't try to bottom out OKC?
I don't know about keep everybody. They certainly could make some moves to shift around some veterans or shift around some pieces. But in terms of the core guys, in terms of like the SGAs of that roster, I don't see any huge move like that.
I feel like Dort's a core guy.
He's very good.
Dort is like
very
exactly
good.
who you'd want in the once we get to the Final Four of a playoff series. Let's talk about the Suns quickly. We both really love the Suns. You tell me what you love about the Suns.
I love that they're at this sweet spot in terms of a team that has its shit together, but also has all these young guys doing new and exciting things. You have Chris Paul directing traffic, but you have Mikal Bridges being adventurous on drives for really the first time in his NBA career. And especially with how underwhelming their starting lineup had been to start this season by the numbers, like they just hadn't been performing the way you would expect. They feel like sleeping giant sounds strong, but like what's slightly smaller than a giant? Some sleeping colossus. Like this is a team that if it made a couple of either a roster move or now we've seen they've shuffled their starting lineup. Frank Kaminsky, fresh off the waiver wire at the start of the season, is now a starter. Or Cam Johnson.
He plays crunch time for them sometimes.
He's been huge, and as they've made those kinds of moves and they're getting the rotation to shake out a little bit, this feels like a really good team.
Totally agree. I said a few weeks ago, I talked about them on a pod, and I was saying one of the things that jumped out, and it was early, you don't want to overreact, but the thing that jumped out to me was that they had a specific pace to them that was unique to them. You could see it in all the pace and the shots per 100 possessions, all those stats. And in the last 5 minutes, they just seem like they have an advantage. And you could see it again last night with Milwaukee. They were really good last 5 minutes of the fourth quarter team. I think the revelation for me has been Cam Johnson. Bridges, I think people felt really highly of when he came out of the draft. And I know when Philly traded him, the Philly fans were bummed because it was like, that's the perfect 3-and-D athlete that everybody's looking for these days. I'm not surprised that he's good. The Cam Johnson thing, I thought that was a terrible pick. Last year, he just seemed like a gunner. This year, there's an all-aroundness to his game, right? Sometimes he'll grab a rebound and he'll run the fast break himself and have a 3-on-2. He's athletic. I think he's good at, him and Bridges are both pretty good at switching on D. Like that was not the book on Cam Johnson coming out of college, that this was going to be a guy who could defend people. And he's clutch. Both of those guys, at the end of these games, they'll have wide open shots. Everyone will gravitate to Chris Paul or Booker, and those guys will be open, and they'll actually make the shots. I think their crunch time 5 is really good. And it's interesting to me that Crowder's not in it. It's definitely, it's Bridges, it's Cam Johnson, it's Chris Paul, it's Ayton, Booker. And those 5 guys play really well together, which goes back to what we're talking about the Pelicans, where it's like these 5 guys, what's your lineup? Who plays well together? The opposite is the Suns. They have 5 guys that play really well together.
They're one of those teams who, especially with young teams, I try to think about like what gives this team stability and what gives them upside. And shout out to Monty Williams for this, because I think he's part of the stability of that team. He gives them pretty set structure. They play pretty conservative on defense. Chris Paul is certainly a part of that, getting guys in the right places. And then they have Booker and Ayton and Bridges and Johnson, who are these upside swings. And Chris Paul in crunch time, one of the best upside swings we have. There's just a good blend here. And the Cam Johnson piece of that I really like. And I think he's probably the closest thing they have to an answer at the 4 long term, whether it's starting or finishing. Like they're doing a thing right now where Frank Kaminsky's starting based on matchups. If they have like more of a traditional 4 type, Kaminsky will be in there. But I think Cam Johnson is that guy ultimately. I just don't think there's enough matchups that are really going to punish him. And I like that dynamic you described just in terms of being a slinkier, longer athlete who can get them into some better spaces.
Yeah, and if you talked about, are they a move away from making the West Finals? Utah, which we can talk about another time. Every year there's the team that looks awesome for the first 2/3 of the season, and it's usually a team that has a real history playing together and just comes out of the gate. They look awesome, and then at some point we start to be like, oh, they could win the title, and then they peak first 2/3. I don't know if that's going to happen with Utah or not, but they would be the leading candidate for that. Lakers, pencil them in. Clips, the way Kawhi's playing, I think have to be taken seriously still as the number 2. But I think after that, I think the Suns are in the 4 spot. And the question for me is, how do they leapfrog Utah and the Clippers? Because you don't want to be in the 4 spot and have to play the Lakers in round 2. You need to get to 3, right? I don't see a path for them now unless they make a trade. And the bummer is, I keep saying this, but had they drafted Halliburton, I feel like that would have been enough.
A lot of teams singing that tune these days.
Oh my God. Well, it's not like we all didn't fucking know he was going to be good. I mean, Jesus. It's 6 months to study the draft. But other than that, the Kaminsky spot would be the spot you'd have to upgrade, right?
Yeah. I think that's the easy one to dial up in terms of need. How they get there is a different question. I think one of the good things about them is with those other 4 guys, you could go with a lot of different types of players. DeAndre Ayton is flexible enough as a big that you could pair him with all kinds of different guys. And he's an interesting counterpoint to Zion as, Ayton came into the NBA with huge red flags about his defense and has really made himself into a pretty competent team defender, a guy who's reliable on that side of the ball. That's the leap that Zion needs to make. It's, as we do all these kind of counterpoint with the Suns and Pelicans, it is worth noting these 2 teams played each other like a week ago, and the Pelicans worked over the Suns on one of their good nights. So there's a little more variance with New Orleans, but I like the stability of where Phoenix is.
Yeah, the Ayton stuff started at last year when he came back from the suspension, because I wasn't sure if he was a bust, but I wasn't a fan. And you could see something different after the suspension where it's like, oh, this guy actually makes sense with how we play basketball now. I like watching him.
Yeah.
I really like, there's 6 guys on this Suns team that I really enjoy watching. And I think for him, he's averaging 12.5 rebounds a game this year. I think has pretty good hands. I think he plays hard. I think he gives a shit. He's tough. I think he's not Luka Doncic, but I don't think we'll be talking about how they took Ayton first, like the way we talk about Sam Bowie or something like that. He's a good player.
No.
The X factor to me is Sarge, who I've always liked. I don't know if he makes sense in this current NBA. He's only played 7 games. He'll be back at some point. What is he? If you put him in that Kaminsky thing with what we thought Sarge was a couple years ago, maybe you don't need to make a trade.
Yeah, I think if he could be that player, but I think the ship has kind of sailed. I mean, if anything, he and Kaminsky both work with that dynamite second unit they've had. And really, I think we probably need to give the Suns more credit for bargain hunting, for really, pulling up guys out of the scrap heap, whether that's Campaign, whether that's Dario Saric after he was left for dead. Like, they've really put together one of the best benches in the NBA without a lot of resources to do it. And so Saric, to me, whether it's Kaminsky or Saric, there's a playmaking big in that kind of spot off the bench that I think makes a lot of sense. But I don't know, as a starter, and I was a Dario apologist for a long time, but even I can't quite get there in terms of him being a finishing piece for them.
Yeah, he definitely got a lot of fumes from the process. People just wanted those process guys to be really good. And I think the thing I liked about him is I did feel like he, in the last 5 minutes, was not afraid of the moment and would make a couple shots and things like that. For the team that they have, I'm not sure he's going to be there. And then Crowder's the other one who's playing 27 a game, but I think in the playoffs is a guy you're going to need. So I guess the thing for me would be the Kaminsky Sarge spot that's a really easy spot to upgrade as you get closer to the trade deadline. There's going to be those dudes are available. Those Patrick Patterson, but a little bit better types. But then the other thing it would be campaign. Is that our third guard in the playoffs?
I mean, he was in the bubble at least. I mean, like MVP of the bubble campaign, basically.
Yeah. All right. We both like the Suns. So they're 15-9 right now. They probably need some help from an injury standpoint with one of the two teams ahead of them. It seems like Utah, at least regular season wise, is going to be there.
They're excellent. I mean, I'm kind of sold on them as a contender, to be honest with you.
So you are sold. You're buying.
I mean, to the extent that anyone is really capable of competing with the Lakers right now, like the matchup stuff with LeBron and AD is always going to be tough for everyone out there. But every other box they check.
So if you're making the case for it, Conley's just way better this year.
Yep.
And the Jordan Clarkson thing is kind of out of nowhere, where he's like this heat check guy who's feast or famine, but now he's like a pretty consistent heat check guy.
He's like a reformed heat check guy. He went to some kind of camp where they got rid of his heat check brainwashing, and now he's like playing in the flow of a real NBA offense. I think it really works for him.
Last thing before we go, you wrote about Miami, and you cautioned everybody not to give up on Miami. Right now, they're 10-14. They're in the 11th spot. We know they're going to be in the playoffs. But yet 10-14 with a 72-game season, and you have one more Jimmy Butler sprained labrum or one of those things where they lose another 10 games. Then all of a sudden it starts to get a little uptight. But you feel like this is their team the rest of the way, or you think they would tinker with it?
I feel like they feel pretty good about what they have, in part because they haven't seen it in total. Like we haven't seen Avery Bradley as a part of this team yet, really. Some of these other components that they haven't been able to work in because of injuries and COVID absences and all that. But I mean, you're spot on about Jimmy Butler. Like if he misses any significant time, they're in a bad way. We've seen that. And some of that is surprising in terms of you would think a Bam Adebayo driven offense with a bunch of shooting could work. But defenses have keyed in on those shooters so hard. They've taken away so much of that stuff. And even though Bam is shooting mid-range jumpers now, he's looking great, he's scoring at the best rate in his career, those lineups have been a real problem. But I think the reassuring point is when Butler's on the floor, they win. They win those minutes, they win games. When Butler and Bam are on the floor together, they're even better. Like all those kind of big picture signs are still there. It's just, turns out you need your all-NBA players to be good.
How much of effect do you think the awful uniforms have had on their season? It's got to be at least 20%, right? Those are the worst uniforms anyone's come up with. There's been some really bad uniforms this year. Phoenix's last night were awful too. I don't know what we're doing.
Which Miami ones do you not like? The pink and blue combo?
Yeah, even like my family, like they were on last night or 2 nights ago. I can't remember. My wife was walking by the TV and she's like, what is that? Why are they doing that? Like she was like angry. Why? Do they think people will buy those? What is that?
It's a little too take a good idea and make it airbrushed for me in terms of that particular look. But I mean, the rest of the Vice stuff has been so clean. I almost can't blame them for trying to push it one step further.
We're like, I guess we're at the 1/3 mark, maybe a little past. If you had to pick your East Finals right now, what would it be?
I think Bucks Sixers. I want to believe in the Nets. Certainly on the right nights, they're totally overwhelming. But I think Embiid is getting to the Sixers to that point where they have to be taken really seriously. I trust their defense pretty much. If you're looking at who has the strongest offense or defense in the East, like what can you really hang your hat on? What can you build around? I trust Philly's defense about as much as anything out there.
I'm the same way. To me, the Lakers game was the moment for me.
Huge.
They went toe-to-toe with those dudes. They had just as much size, just as much power, and just as much of an ability to score at the end of games. And that one, and the Simmons' ability to guard LeBron, I thought was really eye-opening. He didn't stop him, but we've seen two guys kind of go toe-to-toe with LeBron. 3, actually, because Lou Dort.
I was about to say, Lou Dort has to be in this conversation.
The stunning one to me was Patrick Williams, who I think is a gem. I really like this draft. I've talked about it in previous podcasts. I'm pro 2020 draft. I like these guys. I think Patrick Williams is really good.
Well, the Bulls are going full high degree of difficulty every night for Patrick Williams. He's guarding some of the toughest matchups out there. And I think that I'm kind of wait and see on his offense in terms of some of the, how that's going to shake out, whether he's really going to be a great shot creator in time. But defensively, he's up to those challenges, which is exactly what you would want a player as young as him to be.
Yeah, I kind of like watching the Bulls. It's a team that they're like the Pelicans. They're probably the Eastern Conference Pelicans. They don't totally make sense, but there's enough going on that I like it. So you have LA versus LA in the West if you had to bet on it right now, or would you put Utah?
I think the default is still LA versus LA, but Utah I think is probably closer than a lot of people think to cracking that door.
The X factor with this stuff would be if we have fans for May, June, and like if Utah's a 2 seed, but they actually have home games in Utah with fans.
That's true.
That's a real thing. Whereas like the Clippers, who decided to roll over their money for the season ticket holders next year without giving us any input or bonuses or anything. Don't worry, we're not bitter about that, Steve. But I'll be really curious to see like the atmosphere of these teams in these half-filled arenas where like Utah could have a real advantage. At a Clippers home game against the Lakers, it'll be mostly Lakers fans in a half-full arena. That'll be like the weirdest vibe ever. So I guess we'll see. Rob Mahoney, pleasure as always. Check out his piece on the Miami Heat, which you can read on theringer.com. Thanks for coming on.
Thanks, Bill.